Hello to all of the attendees, and thank you for joining us today for this panel. Before I get started, an announcement on Spanish language interpretation from our partner, Angie. Or I think Angie might have dropped off. We'll go with an announcement on Spanish language interpretation from either Murtado or Flora, if possible, just to explain how the Zoom works. I see it in the chat. So anybody that is needing information on accessing interpretation in el español, you can get that information in the chat. Para todas las personas que quieren información acerca de la traducción al español, esa información está ahí en el chat. Well, thank y'all. Today we have assembled an expert panel consisting of scholars from multiple universities across the United States. Dr. Michael D. Schulman from North Carolina State University, Dr. Florence Becot from Penn State University, Ms. Maritza Pierre from The Ohio State University, Dr. Lorann Stallones from Colorado State University, and Dr. Paul Lasley from Iowa State University. The conversation will be moderated by Dr. Mary Hendrickson from the University of Missouri, and I will be the discussant, Dr. Andy Smolski from North Carolina State University. This panel is sponsored by the Rural Sociological Society and the Southern Ag Exchange Network, and presents a discussion on farm crisis. The contemporary landscape for farming contains parallels and divergences with the 1980s farm crisis. Economic perils are translating into harmful mental and physical health consequences and putting at risk the solvency of farms and agrarian communities. The assembled scholars will place agrarian challenges under a critical lens to discuss the longer historical trajectory that produces structural faults. In a sense, while they describe a crisis then in the 1980s and now in the 2020s, we may be in a chronic crisis, punctuated by acute episodes where conditions exacerbate. Even more, how we define crisis is dependent upon our social position, and there is a need to account for how the idea of farm crisis may shift in relation to differentiated segments of the farming population. Before I turn the discussion over to Dr. Hendrickson, I ask that panelists speak in an intentional cadence to permit the interpreters to follow along with the conversation. Also, audience, please place your questions in the Q&A function that you will find in the bottom toolbar in Zoom. We will begin with a set of questions that each panelist will respond to, followed by questions that I develop based on the conversation. Afterward, we will address the questions submitted by the audience. Now, over to you, Dr. Hendrickson.
Thank you, Dr. Smolski. So I'm so thrilled to be here and with this great panel, and I'm so excited that it has come to fruition. So I'm going to get right into things. I would like the panelists to provide an introduction of your research, your experience, your personal experience in this arena, your knowledge about farm-related issues. And I'm particularly interested in how your disciplinary background informed your understanding of farm crisis, either then in the 1980s or now or ongoing. So I'm going to kick it off, I think, with Dr. Stallones from Colorado State. And then we'll go around and talk to each of the panelists.
Good morning. I'm an epidemiologist by training. I began working in agriculture, safety, and health many years ago in the 1980s. My first work was related to respiratory diseases, but we rapidly discovered that farmers had a high occurrence of injuries. I moved to the University of Kentucky and did a study of injuries, fatal injuries, and fully a third of all of the injuries we looked at were suicide related. So I followed the path of trying to understand why this particular working population would have such a extraordinary rate of suicide-related deaths. And during that time, it was during the farm crisis, which I was not aware of. I'm an epidemiologist. I look for connections. And obviously, one of the connections that predicts suicide is our economic circumstances. The other things that we followed related to depression and anxiety as precursors to suicide, and that led us in to trying to understand unique stressors in agricultural populations. And then finally, I did a significant amount of work linking suicide, depression, anxiety, and neurobehaviors to pesticide exposures. So my entree into the farm crisis happened as the timing of the work I was doing more than focusing specifically on that particular episode. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we're going to move to the rest of the panel is primarily rural sociologists. So I think we'll move to Dr. Lasley now, and then to Dr. Schulman before we bring the more recent scholarship to the fore. So Dr. Lasley?
Well, good morning. I guess Dr. Schulman and I, being the two seniors with on the panel, but I appreciate the panel. My background, I was raised on a farm in northern Missouri. I got my PhD in rural sociology with a collateral area in agricultural economics. I became aware of the first shock, major sort of economic shock, was the Russian grain deal in 1972 when I was an undergraduate. That fueled the go-go years in which my family and my wife's family and everyone that I knew were celebrating the escalation in commodity prices based on the 1973 Russian grain deal, in which Russia purchased for the first time 10 billion tons of U.S. grain stocks that immediately infused a euphoria in agriculture that then resulted in increased land values, euphoria. Earl Butz was Secretary of Agriculture in those years. He encouraged farmers to plant fence row to fence row, and we first began to see the environmental impacts in fragile agricultural areas as pasture and land that had never been plowed before was plowed up to meet the global demand for food. That occurs at the same time that the World Food Conference was talking about a starving America. That euphoria started to collapse in 1979 as a result of the Federal Reserve Board that reversed fiscal policy, and we went from a period of fixed interest rates to floating interest rates. And farmers that had been encouraged to expand suddenly discovered with higher interest rates, they could not cover their costs. I then joined Iowa State University in 1981. And the first project was to document how this first shock wave of the Russian grain deal was restructuring farming and creating both gains for some and losses for others. So I spent the next 40 years looking at how do shock waves reverberate across rural communities. So I can talk more about that later. But my overall view has been one of how economic shock waves has changed the culture of agriculture. So I look forward to other people's comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lasley. Let's go to Dr. Schulman now.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say hello to my colleagues, both on the panel and who attendees. My background is a bit different, perhaps, in terms of rural sociology. I describe myself as an accidental rural sociologist. My father had 1/4000th of an acre, all in pasture in the middle of Chicago. I actually wrote an essay in a book called Rural Sociologists at Work. But during my graduate career at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, I worked with Professors Havens and Flynn, who were well known for their international and national work in rural sociology. I wound up teaching intro courses in the field, and therefore I took a position as a rural sociologist, actually starting in 1977 at North Carolina State University. One set of studies that I did in the early 1980s kind of reflected the social and ecological environment that I was starting to learn about in North Carolina. And this was a set of studies based upon interviewing a group of Black farmers over a 3-year period of time. I came to North Carolina, and at that point in time, flue-cured tobacco and the particular government program that regulated the price and production of flue-cured tobacco was a major aspect of the agricultural structure. There was also general concern about the decline of Black farmers from their high point of land ownerships at the early part of this century. So I was able to do what in sociological lingo called a panel study, which simply means that we interviewed the same people at more than one period of time. And we were able to track this group of predominantly small-scale Black tobacco farmers who geographically were in the northern part of the state over time. And not surprisingly, what we found was that ownership, particularly of tobacco quota, which was a property right under the old flue-cured tobacco program, was a key variable in determining whether or not they stayed in agriculture. There were also parts of the study that led us to issues that other scholars had brought up with regards to the survival of Black farmers, mainly issues related to heirs property, and that involves owning land where there's not clear title, whether or not there are wills, and issues of discrimination, particularly in lending from both private and public agencies. In the latter part of the 1980s, particularly I think in 87, 88, as the dimensions of the farm crisis that Paul described echoed throughout various geographical regions. I was in charge of, again, of a series of empirical studies, but these were statewide random sample surveys of farm operators. And there were a number of us in Rural Soc at Ohio State, at Iowa State in particular, who were doing these type of surveys, and we shared our instruments and the way in which we developed our research protocols. And what I was able to do, given the resources here in North Carolina State, was again to do a study where we looked at people across time. In this case, a study from 87 and 88. What we found, and again, consistent with other studies that rural sociologists were doing in terms of trying to understand what contributed to people's survival and what also were some of the causes of depression or other mental health problems. We found that, for example, financial strain and depression were mediated by perceptions of personal control, economic hardship, and particularly social support. So what we found necessarily, to make it kind of a long story short, is that there were important aspects of farm life relating to formal and informal social support, the role of women in the household, particularly in their relationship to generating off-farm work, that were important in terms of trying to understand the process of stress and depression that was generated by the economic and political crises that Paul described. And I will pass the mic.
Thank you, Dr. Schulman. I think we're going to go to Ms. Pierre from Ohio State now, because Dr. Becot and Ms. Pierre have kind of entered into this in a little bit different way at a different time. So I'll have you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background and your disciplinary perspective and so on.
Sure. I am Maritza Pierre. I am a PhD candidate in rural sociology at Ohio State University. I have a master's degree in sustainable agriculture and community and regional planning from Iowa State University. I broadly study the sociology of food and agriculture. My dissertation research, which I am wrapping up right now, is on Black farmers and climate adaptation. And this research is a comparative study between Ohio and North Carolina. And it's really looking at how climate change is impacting Black farmers, recognizing that climate change is already affecting farmers in the United States, and not all farmers are equally affected by climate impacts. And climate change adaptation and resilience are influenced by access to resources, which are unevenly distributed, and also knowing the history of racial discrimination that Black farmers have faced as it pertains to their access to resources or access to loan. And knowing all of that, I was interested in seeing how the lingering effect of racial discrimination, if there was still an effect on Black farmers, and how that might impact their climate adaptation strategies. So that's what my research is about. As far as the farm crisis is concerned, my research obviously is not directly on the farm crisis. However, as a rural sociologist interested in agriculture, the farm crisis was an inevitable topic that has shaped the fabric of rural America and farmers, and a topic that rural sociologists who study the sociology of food and agriculture cannot escape. And I also found myself reflecting on the term crisis and other crises that may not have been given the same attention or even the title of a crisis. So this is where I'm coming into this topic from the perspective of racial marginalization, and also looking at impending challenges and awaiting crises.
Thank you. And we're going to finish up this round of introductions with Dr. Becot from Pennsylvania State University.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks so much for having me. So I am a rural sociologist, but also have a background in applied economics and community development. And in terms of the work that I do, it's really focused on the health, safety, well-being, and economic viabilities of farm families. But before I touch on how my work touches on mental health, I want to talk quickly about my background, personal background. So I grew up in France. With family members with strong connections to agriculture. Both sets of grandparents were in agriculture. And I think today some of their operations would be considered subsistence agriculture. But then aunts and uncle took over the farm operation or started their own farm operations. And so growing up, I spent a lot of time on farms, and I spent a lot of time visiting neighbors' farms. I always thought it was the most boring thing because we'd go to the neighbor's farm and look at yet another barn and yet more cows. And I was like, aren't we done yet? And then the conversation about agriculture would not end at the barn. It would be taken during those long meals that we have in France. It's not uncommon to have a 5-hour lunch, and a lot of conversation about ag policies. So as much as I did not hear about the farm crisis of the US until I moved to the US, my upbringing was really shaped by the development of the European Union and the strengthening of the European Union, in particular as it pertains to community agricultural policies, and a lot of heavy concerns around how these ag policies were going to impact farmers, a lot of concerns around what it was going to do to farmers' livelihood, including in my own family. The other aspect too, I think, of my personal life that really is shaping my work is how France compared to the US is very different in terms of the social policy that France has, and in terms of how different countries decide to support their folks in different ways, and how in France occupation, and not to say that it's a perfect system, there's no perfect system, right? But how there's more of this vision that no matter your occupation, people should be able to meet their basic needs. And so growing up in France, and even to these days, the idea that a farmer could lose a farm because of a medical debt, because they had cancer, because they lost a limb, not something that that is talked about, right? And so that connects to my work. The work that I've been doing is, while early on I was really focused on the economic viability of the farm operation, adoption of practices, really my interest lay in how do we support the health and well-being of farm populations, and also how can agriculture be an exciting career opportunity for folks who want to do it. And all of that layered onto the idea that we have an aging and shrinking farm population, and a lot of really big questions around who is going to be the next generation of farmers. And so the way that I've looked at this, first of all, in my training, as Maritza was saying, as a rural sociologist, we cannot escape the farm crisis. I approached it more from the farm persistence literature. Michael, Paul, I was reading your work. And it's informed what I've done. And really, the idea of doing farmer mental health work was a bit incidental as well, where it was looking at farm persistence and the factors that shape farmers' ability to stay on the land, really looking at the role that social policy can or could play. And then was invited by colleagues Shoshana Inwood, Carrie Henning-Smith, and Andrea Bornstad, who had started a project that was in 2019 looking at farmer mental health interventions. And 2019, if you remember, was about the time when we were starting to talk about the farm income crisis. So the next big crisis that was being compared to the 1980s. And at that time too, the timing was very, for better or for worse, fortunate, in the sense that it was before FARSON. And so it was before a lot of the new resources had been expended. And so we did an inventory of what do farmer mental health interventions look like in the Midwest. And then in other works that I was doing also with Shoshana at Ohio State, looking at childcare and health insurance, it seems that even though the focus of our work started with childcare and health insurance from the economic of farm business viability, children's safety, issues of mental health would rear its head, where people would talk about the connections between health insurance being both a stressor and an impediment to access to care, for example. And so currently I'm working on a 5-year project funded by CDC, National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, where we're looking at farmers' help-seeking strategies as it pertains to their mental health. But of course, as a rural sociologist, I wasn't only interested in those individual level behaviors, but really around how does the larger environment in which people are embedded shape whether or not they're sick health, but also do they even see themselves as having a problem versus suffering the consequences of external level stressors. And so in short, it's a mixed method study where we are focusing and also case study approach, where we're looking at counties in the Midwest that are seen as having better mental health outcomes and comparing them with counties that have worse mental health outcomes. And so I leave it there, and then later on, as we talk more, I'll be sharing some of those findings.
Thank you, Florence. So just a reminder to all the panelists to keep their cadence a little slower so that we can make sure that the interpretation goes well. I know that I'm very guilty of speaking too fast often. So thank you, everyone, because you can see that we've got such a diverse array of folks here with a diverse array of experiences. And we've started to touch on the questions of the forces that cause the farm crisis of the 1980s. We could call it the continual crisis. We could talk a little bit about how racialized lenses on agrarian crisis, gendered lenses, affect how we think about the periodizing of these crises. I know that Bill and Judy Heffernan, who were mentors of mine here at the University of Missouri, said, you know, there are 600,000 farmers who lost their farms in the 1980s. They can't all be bad managers, right? And that is a lot of, I think that's something that we want to talk about here about the forces and what are some of the what were the forces then? What are some of the contemporary challenges that we see farmers and agrarian communities confronting? Paul talked quite a bit about the financial policy. Florence talked about the social policy. We heard from Lorann and Michael about the impacts of this on mental health. And for the audience, I promise we're coming to solutions, but let's talk just a little bit more about untangling some of those forces that contributed in the 1980s that are doing so now, and maybe longer term gender and racial lens on the crises as it goes forward. So I'm going to just open it up to whoever wants to take that first, but let's talk about these forces and challenges before we go into solutions. Who'd like to start?
Well, Mary, I can build on that a bit. I think in order to talk about the farm crisis of the 1980s or the current crisis, one really has to place that in a historical context. The farm crisis of the 1980s, which was the most devastating crisis in agriculture since the Great Depression, has a number of parallels to the Great Depression of the 1930s. When, as a young rural sociologist at Iowa State, I had the benefit of having some folks that had worked with the farm crisis in the Great Depression of the 1930s that mentored me and assisted. So my benefit of their historical analysis informed my work in terms of understanding what were the drivers of the farm crisis of the 1980s. I mentioned earlier, you really have to go back to the early 1970s, the growing concern about world population, the World Food Conferences that were held actually at Iowa State, the Club of Rome that met, the Russian crop failures of 1971 and 72 that led them to come to the United States and essentially bought the entire granary. That then created this huge surge, the doubling and tripling of commodity prices that fueled this euphoria that many felt was going to be the new reality of higher commodity prices. And that encouraged farmers across the country to expand, to modernize. That drove up the price of land. That drove up the price of purchased inputs. And so this euphoria that was undergirded by government policy of get big or get out. I think it's important to realize that the farm crisis of the 1980s, however, really sort of accelerated the longer term historical trends in the structure of American agriculture. That this wasn't a new pattern. It simply was an acceleration, because we'd been seeing the number of family farms decline since the Great Depression. The number of farms in the United States peaked in 1932 or 1930s at around 6.8 million. They've declined to about 2.4 million in the early 80s. So that loss of family farms and the consolidation of farming and the demise of rural communities was a 50-year trend before the farm crisis. So I think it's terribly important that we look at this from a historical perspective. It was only then that we began to understand that as farmers expanded, they took on large debts. That made sense to be in debt when you had fixed interest rates and high inflation. It's only when the Federal Reserve Board said inflation is public enemy number one that we revised our fiscal policy and moved from fixed interest rates to floating interest rates. And farms that were financially solvent in the late 70s and early 80s became insolvent. They couldn't meet their payments. And that then triggered this avalanche that we call the farm crisis. The loss of farms, the loss of Main Street businesses, the things that many of us have already talked about, has to be interpreted and understood as sort of macro level changes that restructured not only farming, but rural life and rural communities. And as a sociologist, I undertook to try to understand how individual adaptations to uncertainty and economic crisis then restructured rural communities and rural society. So I created the Iowa Farm and Rural Life Poll in 1982, a panel study, a longitudinal panel study that is still going, even though I've retired, directed by Dr. J. Arbuckle at Iowa State, where we have documented over 40 years now how individual adaptations to economic uncertainty that are very rational, are very logical, very prudent, but they have devastating impacts on Main Street. So one of the things that happens when people face economic uncertainty, whether it's on farms or in factories, when you lose your job or you lose income, you tighten your belt, you reduce expenditures. And the reducing of expenditures means less business for family-owned businesses that are selling clothing and food and furniture and automobiles and farm machinery. And so what was called the farm crisis morphed into a rural crisis that engulfed many of our rural towns. So I just want to make sure we get this understanding of the historical context. So let me pass the baton.
Who would like to follow up on that? Dr. Schulman?
Well, thank you, Paul. Again, I think there's on the one hand, sociologists of agriculture talk about these long-term structural changes in agriculture. And whether they're doing theoretical or empirical work, it can be summarized. I would summarize it as fewer farms, larger scale units, increased concentration of production in the larger scale units. So there's these long-term underlying structural changes. And then, as Paul kind of articulated, the 80s, in addition to these long-term underlying changes, were a period of rapid change involving integration into global commodity and financial markets, changes in macroeconomic policy as it relates to monetary policy and debt. And again, pressure to expand, increase production, and issues related to government policy. So in a certain sense, there's long-term structural changes. There are the short-term, more shorter-term issues related to economic, political, and global economic policy. We could also argue that in a certain sense, the crisis is not anything new for certain segments of the farm population, particularly African-American farmers and other minorities, where in a sense, they've also been subject to the same structural changes, but also issues related to discrimination in terms of lending and government policies, both at national and the local level. What I'd like maybe to just spend a minute or two on is perhaps thinking about what we may have learned from looking at these crises. And this is just some takeaways from, reading the studies and work that we've done. And again, this is my own kind of list. We've learned that social support is important, both from formal and informal networks. Again, perhaps there's the stereotype of the rural community where everybody knows each other well and is supportive and sharing. But we understand that that's a stereotype, subject to depopulation and subject to all sorts of social and economic fractures within the community. But we've learned that, be it the faith community, be it farmer-to-farmer organizations, they're important in terms of providing individual and family social support for people undergoing financial distress, mental health crises. So again, we need to pay attention not just to individual networks, but also the networks that are based upon faith, family, and in our own current work that Dr. Smolski and I have been doing, it's important to also look at farmer-led organizations that provide not just social support, but an interpretive frame for understanding what's going on and for reacting to the crises. We've also, in a certain sense, become paying more attention to trying to develop not only social support networks within the farm community, but networks that directly link farmers and consumers. For example, here at NC State, we have our Center for Environmental Farming Systems. They have projects, farm to daycare, farm to elder care. In a sense, again, trying to find alternative networks that directly link farmers and consumers. And there were a number of studies triggered by COVID-19 that, in a sense, investigated what happened when the national markets collapsed and consumers started looking for alternative products and finding alternative networks. We also, in a sense, and I'll say one more point and then I'll turn it over. We also, in a sense, need to pay attention not just to the organization of the farm enterprise and its production of commodities, but also to the organization of the farm household and gender roles. The role of women in providing support for the household, providing income for the farm or health insurance through their off-farm labor. So you need just not to focus on the farm as a unit that produces things to be sold in the marketplace, but the farm as a family that's involved in developing resilience to change, and how this resilience is based on a gender division of labor and organization in the household. And I will stop now and turn the mic over. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's go to you, Florence. This is really fascinating, by the way. I'm learning a lot. So, Florence.
It's like being in a social food in that class. So I'm going to try to build on Paul and Michael. I think to Michael's point on internationalization and globalization, what I think I want to emphasize, and as we were talking to you about solutions and how do we address it, is essentially we have moved towards an era where countries, in particular as it pertains to agriculture, have a lot less independence in terms of determining their own policies and in terms of determining the ways in which to support the agricultural sector. And I'm speaking specifically about the World Trade Organization and the different boxes of colors, amber. I never remember what they are. And so it's something too that I think both for us in the US, but also any countries that is looking to address farmer mental health and the root causes connected to the structure of agriculture, their ability to change some of those things is making it harder, those World Trade agreements. The other thing too that I want to talk about too is the privatization of some of the standards in agriculture and how, and Mary, I think that touches on your work, so I'm going to make sure I don't say things that are inaccurate, but in the sense where we've moved towards an era, and again, it's all part of a continuum, right? It's not, nothing is sudden. I think it's very much the continuation of trends that have been going on, as you were saying, Paul, but we have turned into maybe now there's more power coming from the private sector and non-government agencies that are determining what standards should look like, what farmers should do, which also is impacting how we can respond to the crisis. And in terms of responding to the crisis, and Paul, you were talking about how your own work was informed by the 1930s farm crisis, and how my work's been really much formed by the 1980s farm crisis. But in looking at how, I think it's also interesting to look at how governments have responded at different times, in different points in time. And again, I'm not a historian, but what I did notice when I looked at the history of social policies as I was working on my dissertation in France versus the US, and it's the importance of those crisis moments, right, to develop new systems, to be innovative. The crisis of the 1930s brought us systems in the US such as Social Security, which we know that in agriculture doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily a strong support system in the sense that Social Security income can be lower for folks in agriculture. So retirement income for folks who are not familiar with Social Security in the US, but the importance of Medicare too, that has evolved over time and that is really essential for older farmers to access healthcare. So maybe not necessarily connected to mental health, but does play into it, right? And then how we responded in the 1980s for the 19 crisis, right? Some of the responses around how we address the lending, predatory lending, and try to address this. But then I want to talk about the current response of the current farm crisis and COVID, and how a lot of it has been through the Farm Ranch and Stress Assistance Network, which is this network that was funded through the 2018 Farm Bill. And it creates a network across the US, 4 different networks to provide programs and resources to support the mental health of farmers. And to me, it's really interesting as we're having the next conversations about the Farm Bill is the extent to which, and maybe I'm misunderstanding something, but the extent to which there's a sense of, well, we have FARSON, the Farm Ranch and Stress Assistance Network, but I don't see a lot of conversations about how, if we are interested in supporting the mental health of farmers, and we know about the importance of the structure of agriculture, I'm not seeing as much of those conversations around talking about every title of the Farm Bill and how they could be readjusted so that conditions in agriculture are more fair or more equitable, addressing the issues of concentration and consolidation. And again, Mary, I'm looking at your work. I think it's really much more of, well, here, see, we're providing the Band-Aid over here through Farson, and it's almost like we're not going to look at the other side. And again, it might be my interpretation, but I think it's an important thing to talk about how even over time we change the ways in which we respond to crisis and how we are individualizing crisis, I think, more now than we used to.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder, we always need to slow down a little bit for the interpretation. And you're touching on some of the differences now, which I think is good. So Lorann, I'm going to go to you and then Maritza, and then we'll have a little conversation about solutions, potentials.
So all the conversation has raised a lot of thoughts in my head, and I'm going to try to walk through a little bit. My personal experience with agriculture really started with my uncle, who was a farmer in Idaho. He began in sugar beets, and then when the international markets opened up, he moved to pintos. He built his house on selling pinto beans to Mexico, and then he moved to soy. And none of his children wanted to continue in farming. He hand set his irrigation pipes. He was still out there doing it even after he retired and leased his farm. So whenever I wanted a reflection on will farmers understand what I'm talking about, I would pass it through him. And he was really good at telling me when I was really going off the rails. The other thing that happened in his community, and I think this speaks a little bit to the history of go large or go home. A lot of the dairy farms in California moved to Idaho, and they became very large dairy farms. And I spent several years in upstate New York in small dairy farming communities, and then moved to Colorado, where there were very few dairy farms at the time. And now we have herds of 5,000, 6,000 being milked. So all of that change is really rapid for people who came up in a small setting. So it frames my thinking about that push to feed the world. So the message was, the US is going to be the breadbasket and feed the world. And in order to do that, the only way that we could grow enough and produce enough was to have bigger, and bigger became better. And now I see a shift back to conversation about how to do regenerative farming, which is going to require smaller plots and smaller activities. It may produce better soils. It may help with some of the other issues that are coming up. But so that's really how I frame thinking about agriculture in general. And then, of course, here in Colorado, they did an amazing job thinking about the food system during COVID and transitioning to direct consumer information. So very, very interesting things have been going on. And I think it helps put the farmers in closer contact and connection and community with the consumers. And I think that's critical. And I think if we're going to improve the health and safety of the workers and the farmers themselves, that has to be part of the conversation. How do we make sure that connection is being made? Now, I know I've wandered off a little bit, but the other thing that we have been working on recently is trying to figure out those community networks, particularly in behavioral health, and putting the faith leaders in contact with behavioral health care providers so everybody understands what their role is and doesn't view it as different, that they're all part of this system and they each have unique skills to bring to make sure that the communities are getting the resources that they need. And we do hope that we can work with Extension as well to be train the trainers in making these dialogues be very productive in terms of supporting health. And one of the things I would say, in my years of experience, USDA has been very, very reluctant to put sufficient dollars into the health and safety of the working community. They put a lot of money into the health and safety of animals and the crops. But as Florence talked about, you know, Farsan is just a tiny piece of what needs to happen in terms of supporting agricultural workers and communities. And obviously, one of the looming difficult issues in the West and in other parts of the country is, what are we going to do about immigrants and immigrant workers? And how are we going to make that a safe place for, whether it's H-2A workers or not? We are not doing a good job, and we need that workforce in order to be able to continue. So I am going to stop there and turn it over back to Maritza.
Thanks, and thank you, Lorann, especially for bringing up the workers, because we have been getting quite a bit of questions about the mental health issues of not only farmers, but farm workers, the community impacts we've talked a little bit about. But Maritza, let's get your take on some of this forces, the challenges, the genderized, racialized lens, all of that. What do you want to say here?
Sure. So we have somewhat based on, well, Dr. Schulman, Florence, and Lorann's comments move towards the solutions, but I'm gonna peel the layers a bit and talk more about the Black farmers, since that's the topic of my dissertation. Dr. Schulman hinted at that and mentioned the racial discrimination, and I'm gonna go back and provide some numbers, and also the argument that I'm making here. And I briefly mentioned that earlier when I talked about what constitute a crisis and what we call a crisis. And what I would say here is that the farm crisis that Black farmers and other minority farmers have experienced in a way preceded the 1980s farm crisis. In 1910, there were about 1 million Black farmers in the US owning close to 15 million acres. And by 1980, when we're getting into the height of the farm crisis for, if we're looking at national numbers, those numbers had dwindled. So as of right now, Black farmers make up less than 2% of the farming population, even though they made up, depending on the source, it's between 14 to 20% back in the 1920s. So in early 70s, well, the number of Black farmers acreage had dropped by more than half. So going into the 1980s, those numbers had dropped significantly. So to put it into perspective, in the 1920, 1 in every 7 farmers was Black. And by 1982, 1 in 67 farmers was Black. So there was a significant drop here, and that mirrors some of the drastic decline that we've seen on a national scale in the 1980s. So what happened? So a couple of factors. In the 1920s, we had the boll weevil that affected cotton growers, and many Black farmers were growing cash crops such as cotton or tobacco. And the Great Depression didn't help. And the 1930s, the New Deal policies, if we're going back to the historical context, as Dr. Lasley has mentioned, we know what the historical context was in the US and Jim Crow laws, etc. The New Deal policies were not helpful to Black farmers. So be it the Agricultural Adjustment Act, for which Black farmers, from which Black farmers were excluded. They did not meet the eligibility criteria. Also, the Farm Credit Administration, established in 1930, provided credit and financial assistance to farmers in rural communities. And the discriminatory practices did not really help Black farmers in terms of accessing the credit that they needed to finance their operation. But the height of the dispossession really happened around the 1950s, 1960s. And that's when post Brown versus the Board of Education, going into the civil rights era, discrimination within the USDA for Black farmers skyrocketed. And there were lots of retaliation cases for farmers who were caught participating in civil rights activities. That's what they were called. So those decisions were intentional and resulted in great dispossession and land loss for Black farmers. And even after 1965, when we had laws against discrimination put in effect, those laws were very slow to permeate the culture of those institutions. So not much has changed in practice. And it took a while for Black farmers to finally, in 1997, file a class action lawsuit, the Pickford case, and eventually get the government to settle. And it was not just Black farmers who were going through those discriminatory practices. Hispanic farmers, particularly in Texas, had experienced a little bit of the same as far as access to credit is concerned, but with the difference that the judge did not rule that a class action was granted in their case. So for Hispanic farmers, there was no class action lawsuit, and they were told that they had to file individually. So really putting it into perspective and highlight how detrimental the 1940s up to the 1970s period has been for Black farmers as far as discrimination is concerned. Now, as far as parsing out the effect of mechanization, the movement of the go big or go out, discrimination, or even hair properties on Black farmers, there is no way to say that this specific factor had 20% to attribute specific weight to those factors. However, scholars have said that from the 1950s to the 1970s, that period was very, it was a very difficult period for Black farmers, and a lot of the land loss occurred during that period of time. So where do we go from here? As far as my research is concerned, a lot of the lingering effect of those discriminatory practices are still in effect and are informing how Black farmers go about seeking assistance, and informing how they go about receiving climate adaptation services climate adaptation advice that are important for them to maintain the future of their farm operation. So even though this happened in the past, the effect of those discriminatory practices still linger. And what I think is the big farm crisis for Black farmers is still lingering the same way we are seeing till this day the effect of the farm crisis of the 1980s. One parallel I want to draw between the farm crisis of the 1980s and what Black farmers went through is as far as access to loan is concerned. So in the 1980s, a lot of the farmers who went under actually were encouraged by experts who were supposed to have their best interests at heart, be bankers or agricultural economists, to borrow more, to expand. And because of the deregulation that occurred, a lot of those requirements were laxed, and people who should not have received loans were allowed to receive loan. And in parallel, we had the opposite happen for a lot of minority farmers. I find that an interesting parallel. And regarding impending challenges, I think that climate change, even though in the United States we are not seeing the brunt of it like farmers in tropical climates are experiencing it. It's already here. Farmers are already being impacted by climate change. And I think that if we do not have even more national pressure to implement climate adaptation policy, climate change is one of those impending crises that farmers on a national scale will face. And also that coupled with farm stress, because climate grief is also a problem for some farmers. So those are the thoughts that I had as far as the farm crisis is concerned.
Thank you, Maritza. That was really great because we had a question earlier about Black farmers starting with enslavement and teaching agriculture. And I think that here we've talked about this century-long crisis that has affected all farmers. But I think it's particularly important to think about the preceding impacts of settler colonialism on brown and Black farmers across the country as well. And so I really appreciate your contribution here in terms of the really highlighting when the crises have occurred for different sets of farmers and communities. And so I want to get to solutions. And so we're going to talk about solutions. I know that Lorann and Florence kind of brought these to the fore. Maritza's talking a little bit about climate change. So let's go with Lorann and Florence talking a little bit about solutions, and then come with Maritza and then Michael and Paul.
That's difficult. I think one of the things that would be helpful is to really frame what are the unique situations that occur in agricultural communities that are different from what are occurring in rural communities, so that we're not putting everything into the same box, but we can solve rural community problems, and some of the stressors that occur within the farming populations will then fall along those lines. I think the other issue that I feel very strongly about is the worker population. If there's a shortage of workers and we're not changing the policies to make it more fair, just, affordable for the workers to come and do the work that has to occur for us to be able, maybe not to feed the entire world, but even the country, we're missing a huge opportunity. And those changes are just, to me, fundamental changes. And you can see in some states where the laws have changed and are being are addressing some of the health and safety issues that occur to the working population. So in Colorado, they've tried in Washington, they've tried in California, and they've tried in New York to make sure that things like stoop posture, heat-related illnesses, some water, obviously we have the water, the housing, those things are laws, but they have to be implemented. We have to have some kind of way to monitor those. Most recently, we've been working with the sheep herders who come into Colorado, and they actually, there was a recent bear attack. So we've got to talk about some of those unique situations where very remote workers are running into carnivore interactions that are extremely dangerous, but it's a small group, so we tend to think it's not a big deal. But I think that taking a step back and sometimes doing those smaller things can be very helpful. And we have colleagues that are working on trying to understand what goes on in the communities where the migrant workers are and how well received they are in those communities, so that they don't feel like they're completely left out. So from that perspective, I think we have some work to do, and I think we do have some solutions if we will put them in place and then make them happen.
Thank you. Go ahead, Florence, Maritza, then Michael and Paul.
So I have 2 pages of notes on what to do. Don't worry. And they're like 10 font size, but don't worry, I won't talk about all of them. I think what's clear from this conversation, it's a multi-pronged solution, right? And it's not saying one versus the other. And it's also acknowledging that they are the manifestation of the crisis that need to be dealt with. And that have been dealt with in part through Farson. And there is also the need to look at how do we address these root causes. The challenge with those root causes, though, is that they are really very political in nature. The structure of agriculture, how we regulate agriculture, how we deal with antitrust laws, how do we enforce them or not enforce them, right? And so I think it's important to recognize that there is going to be a requirement for political appetite to deal with those. With that said, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. I think if we're going to talk about Farson and the upcoming Farm Bill that is in discussion, or at some point would be in discussion again, what I've heard, I want to say 2 things. First, we've seen, at least in the Midwest, the impact that Farson has had, as well as COVID-19 relief, where I want to say that in 3 states that we focused on, the organizations that have that support farmers' mental health and farm workers' mental health has gone from 17 organizations in 2019 to 62 in 2022. And when we look specifically at programs and resources, those have been multiplied by 3, from 28 in 2019 to 93 in 2022. And so what I want to say, and what we're hearing from the interviews, is the impact that those changes are already having in terms of the stigma around mental health and in terms of integrating mental health into larger conversations of agriculture, and how there, as Lorann, you were talking about how historically we haven't talked much about the health of the farmers. We've talked more about the health of their livestock and the crops. There has been an increased conversation around the health and well-being of the farm population, which is really important. At the same time, there are concerns. There are concerns when Farson is a bill that needs to be reauthorized every farm bill. And when there are really big questions around, is that going to be reauthorized again? I've been fortunate to be in conversations with folks who are very integrated in Farson and are really wondering about the folks that they have been training, the expertise that have been developed, the new programs. Are those all going to have to be dropped if Farson is not passed into the Farm Bill? And in some ways, it's not so different from what happened with the 1980s farm crisis. There were a lot of resources that were developed. And as people's gaze turned over to the next crisis, in the sense of, well, the farm crisis is over, we don't need to worry about it. It's important to remember that mental health challenges in agriculture are chronic, they're not episodic. And we need to have that baseline, that important support that is there when someone is thinking about ending their lives, no matter what the reasons might be, right? And so that's a very, I think that's a very maybe easy one, and maybe not as prickly in terms of, can Farson be made in every farm bill, a base program instead of having to be reauthorized every year after every year, because the sustainability of programs is so important for those programs to grow and to be effective. And then I don't want to spend too much, I want to let others talk, but I do want to say the importance of how do we address concentration and consolidation in agriculture? How do we address land prices? How we do address the loss of social and physical infrastructures in rural areas? And that's relevant both for folks who work in agriculture, but outside of agriculture, right? And so it's a very complex problem. And in a lot of ways, mental health is a very productive topic in getting us to think about how do we want our future to be like? And how do we want our future to be mindful to people's health and well-being in a way that is addressed for all involved, not just for those who have more resources.
Great, Maritza, and then Michael and Paul.
All right. So, thank you, Florence. I think you brought a very good point. I think I'll link some of the findings that I'm seeing in climate change a little bit to the conversation on farmers' mental health, because the farmers that I interviewed, the Black farmers that I interviewed, were in fact seeing changes in the climate and were describing the ways that climate change were impacting their farms. And that exacerbated with previous challenges that those farmers have in terms of access to resources, made the problem of climate change even worse. So if we're going to deal with issues of climate change for minority farmers, but also for small scale farmers who may not have access to the same programs, because the programs that we currently have in terms of climate adaptation tend to favor larger scale farmers rather than smaller scale farmers. So all of those issues are only going to compound the mental health issues that farmers are experiencing. So I'm not too familiar with the Farson program, but what I can say is that addressing climate change should also be part of the agenda, and having programs that are more tailored towards smaller scale farmers, and programs that are aimed at minority farmers, and undoing some of the harm that discriminatory practices and lack of resources have done in the past. And that includes the length of the paperwork involved in those programs. So it's one of the things that I hear from farmers is how complicated it is to access even microloans of some of those cost share program, because they have to put money up front, and not having access to that can be very deleterious to farmers.
In the interest of time, Michael and Paul, I'm going to ask you to be pretty brief, and then we're going to see Andy, and then hopefully get time for a couple of questions. So, Michael?
Thank you. The issue that I'd like to bring up is, how do we support the community organizations that we'll find in different geographic locales? For example, even in the 1930s, in the South, there was the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which was an integrated organization and protest group directed at alleviating the wrongs that people experienced. In the 1980s, initially, Prairie Fire, American Agricultural Movement, particularly in the Midwest, but then actually in an excellent article that Paul wrote, he talks about how they turned nativist. Our current work in North Carolina, for example, has put us into contact with the Land Loss Prevention Project, which is an organization of lawyers that provides legal support to farmers on issues of heirs property. The Rural Advancement Fund International is an advocacy group for small and minority farmers. They operate a Farmers of Color network, and they have been, for example, very vocal in trying to pursue justice for contract integrated poultry farmers. We've also had very positive experiences with an African American farmers group based in the northern part, which has been providing both mental health and community support services and services to help aggregate production. So to make a long story short, how do we support the community organizations that admittedly may not be everywhere, but which are in certain areas and which are working with disadvantaged groups to try to provide them both social support and services?
Go ahead.
So Mary, did you tell me to go ahead? Okay, thank you. I may be having some technical difficulties. I agree with everything that's been said. So I'm going to suggest that we need to re-examine some of the assumptions that we operate on. The first one is that profits in farming will lead to prosperous rural communities. The data does not support that. If we simply focus on farm revenues, we've seen rural communities in agriculturally dependent communities continue to decline. We need to think about how profits in agriculture are related to prosperity in rural communities. The second that I would hold up that may give us some direction for the future is making the distinction between food production and commodity production. Large-scale commodity production that's become an industrial process disadvantages people without capital and access to technology, but that's different than food production. The third area that I would lift up for the panel is we need to look at where there are opportunities in the emerging climate crisis. A flexible, resilient agriculture system in an environment that is changing as we speak. Where will there be opportunities for small food growers? You know, if you look at the uncertainty that's being presented, I believe that there are opportunities, and we need to explore those in more detail. My final thought: when we define family farms, we oftentimes talk about who owns the land, who provides the labor, and who provides the capital. There are various definitions of family farms, but those three factors are critical. The issue then, I think, and I've served on the Leopold board, the Leopold Center for Agriculture, Sustainable Agriculture for the last decade or so. The issue of protecting our land resources is no more important than protecting our agricultural workforce. And I think Lorann has talked, several have mentioned that. The other is the importance of capital to get small cultivators so that they can afford to be competitive in food production. We need to make sure that government policy on land stewardship, worker health, training and skills and emotional well-being, and access to capital. The other one that continues to gnaw away at me is access to markets. We need better controls to ensure that small producers have access to markets. I can grow cabbage, I can grow green beans, I can grow a lot of things in the Midwest, but if I don't have access to markets, I'm going to have to either market them at farmers markets or eat them myself. It seems to me that we've done a poor job in ensuring access to markets. So I will stop there because I know, Mary, we're under the pressure of time, but those are at least some of my initial thoughts as we look towards the future.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to turn it over to Andy to kind of discuss it a little bit and then kind of close us out.
Yes. Yeah, because there's two questions in the chat that I want to make sure to get to. So instead of asking my own question, I'm just going to provide a nice summary, like Mary's saying, and then we can turn it over to that Q&A piece. What I'm hearing from across this very detailed, in-depth conversation is a few, I think, important pieces that lead me toward a certain understanding of what y'all are saying, and I hope I'm correct in this. First and foremost, that what we're really talking about, even though we've discussed primarily the United States, is a global and historical agri-food system. I believe Florence and Paul have really highlighted this often, as well as well, all of the panelists, right? But in terms of thinking about like a historical system, I mean, we could even push this further back. That this is, if we wanted to talk about the Enclosure Acts in England, in terms of really how a society moved from predominantly a peasant society into a society where you have people living largely in urban areas and dependent upon fewer and fewer farmers. That is a historical set of decisions that has a trajectory that's around 500 plus years and ongoing, and that was global. And Maritza, by bringing in, as well as Michael, these discussions around race, that is a global system that is racialized, and that the consolidation and concentration in agriculture arise from that global system that converted and expanded commodity frontiers throughout the world. And so dependent upon what part of the world you pick, for instance, if we went to Hawaii and we were looking at farm labor in Hawaii, we would be talking about a certain racial caste hierarchy that involves Filipino labor, that involves Japanese labor, that involves Native Hawaiian labor. If we're in the southeastern United States, we're talking about individuals that were enslaved from off the coast of West Africa, kidnapped, brought here, put into labor. If we're talking about the southwest United States, that racialized labor system looks different. In Brazil, Colombos. So that y'all are correct, and I think impressing this idea that crisis is going to shift also relative to that differentiated populations within that global system. And that means, right, that what y'all are discussing is something, I believe the term used was macro political and macroeconomic, that it's structural in that sense around who owns the land, but also who controls the commodity chains, that the institutional policies, whether those be within a given country or between, Florence brought up the World Trade Organization, right? That also has these impacts of solidifying a certain system. So if y'all are denoting that those things need to be changed, that there has to be network development around social support, and that there are these segments of the population that will have differential experiences of it, I guess what I was left with was a question of what does systemic change then look under what are pluralist conditions? Pluralist conditions that, as Lorann and Paul were getting at, have to connect consumers to farmers to provide market access, that has to think about regenerative agriculture and what that's going to entail, that, as Maritza was pointing out, are thinking about climate change and the sustainability that we're going to be confronting in a 21st century, where in North Carolina, we just didn't have a winter, right? That I guess I was left with that as the question, like, there's a lot on the table. What does mobilization look like, considering the long structural stickiness of the system we now exist within, and the vision of the future that develops from the discussions we're having now? And that is inclusive of the differential experiences and addresses the long-term injustices that might form a bedrock for the stressors that are there. And I wish we had time to actually field that as a question, but I know we need to really let the audience get to ask their questions as well. So just like to thank y'all for generating that piece of discussion around, like, what does mobilization look like in a pluralist world, right? So for the panelists, I think that there are two questions. Mary, would you like me to field those for? The first one, and there's multiple people that have kind of asked this, so I'm going to give a summary version of each of theirs. But basically, the emphasis being on farm labor, and there was some discussion here about it, but the overarching idea is they would like to know, the audience, what does crisis mean to farm workers, specifically with emphasis on farm workers that maybe have H-2A visas, that maybe are undocumented, that, what does it mean for them? And how does that also link back into, right, crises in the farming system overall? And really, it's kind of open to whoever would like to discuss that. It's a big one.
I'm happy to start.
Yeah.
I've lived and worked most of the time in the West, where immigrant and migrant workers are quite common and needed. And I think that if you start with the H-2A visa workers, it is the most disenfranchised working population, I think, that we have in the United States in terms of their human rights. So I think the system itself violates their human rights, and I think that needs to change. And I think in the realm of undocumented workers, I think it becomes a huge problem. We don't know how many there are because it's a sticky problem. I think we have to change our perspective and do away with the whole notion of workers that are needed being undocumented or unwelcome. So, that's just my perspective on the free exchange of labor. Where you need workers, you should allow workers in, and you should welcome them, and you should provide them with all of the resources that we expect of a safe and healthy working population. I understand that's a huge lift, and I understand it's a huge political football, but I think if you talk to the farmers who are struggling to get workers into work on their land and work with them, they might be a great partnership in changing the system. So that's what I think needs to happen. I don't know when it's going to happen. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I think we've got to stop building walls.
I might add, I agree completely with Lorann on that. I'm broadcasting from 60 miles north of Tucson, Arizona this morning. We are acutely aware of the immigrant problem here in Arizona, where I spend my winters. I think attached to that is, why is it that our existing primarily white population will not take up those farm labor jobs? And I see that not only out here in the West in the fruit and vegetable industries, but in packing plants across the Midwest, where we have seen a huge influx of international immigrants, because local people will not take those jobs. We have created the crisis in this country by not rewarding labor, by not making them meaningful jobs. And that's a historical fact. So we need to not only address the immigrant labor, but we also need to talk about labor across farming and the food processing distribution system. They're interconnected. So I agree. It's a human rights issue. It violates much of what the United States stands for, and it's a long historical embedded problem.
I'd like to let Florence and Maritza and Michael kind of take another, if you want to take a shot at any of the questions or anything. I know we're out of time. We had some questions about farm policy, and I know that Florence had a lot to say on that, and as did Maritza. So if you guys want to take a little bit of a wrap up there, Andy, what you think? And then unfortunately, I think we're going to have to conclude this.
Yeah. I see there's interest in Andy's question about what does pluralist mobilization for a different agri-food system look like. And Andy, are you talking about on a global scale or on a national scale, or?
I mean, technically thinking about it in terms of a national context, but also I would say the largest social movement organization in the world is La Via Campesina, and it is a pluralist organization. So kind of at the scale that you would like to discuss it, really.
I'll say, well, I'll talk on a global scale, but more so on a North-South relationship and recognizing the impact that U.S. foreign policy has on other countries. I'll say that if we're going to have this multi-scale pluralist mobilization, it would have to start with a level playing field, which we don't have now, and as far as like the relationship between like country of the global north and country of the global south is concerned, which is also part of the global agricultural policy question. And I'm thinking, well, being from Haiti, I'm thinking about how US policies have impacted the rice industry and Haiti, from Haiti being able to sustain itself to tariff being forced to be lowered with restructural adjustment program, and how now Haiti is a net importer of rice, specifically from Arizona. And for such a small country, I think we're among the top 10. I don't remember the number, I want to say number 3 or number 4, but quite a big importer of US rice, and Haiti is not the only one. So leveling the playing field to make sure that we're not externalizing our problems elsewhere, but also this pluralist mobilization is going to look like I guess collaboration with also sectors who may not be nicely embedded into the agricultural field, because as we've been having this conversation here, one thing that we all have highlighted is the impact that those crises have on mental health. Because if we do have issues that are affecting economic like the livelihoods of farmers and our economic structures, they take a toll on mental health. So we're going to have mental health advocate involved. We're going to have food access folks involved. Urban agriculture is on the rise. Also, how does that fit into the broader policy conversation we're having? Climate change is an issue that is also on the rise for farmers. How are we embedding climate change policy into our existing policies, how do we carve out like more for those type of challenges. So that's where my mind is going. I'll let other people talk.
In a lot of places, because we've talked about so many things, but maybe I want to talk about my struggles as I do this work, and really the questions that I'm asking myself, right? Because I think, my mind, my bias is that oftentimes go to what are the structural level issues, right? Because in some ways it's kind of like, well, if we fix the problem at its root, right, wouldn't that be much easier? And then we all live happy ever after. But we know that it's not the reality of the world that we live in. And so I've been really thinking about what are the different levels of interventions that we can work on. For example, extension, right? Most of us here today are from land-grant universities where we have extension system, and extension has done a lot of work around farmer mental health, but what are other things that extension can do and is not already doing? But also I want to acknowledge or bring to the forefront some of the tension, and I've seen it in other works that I've done where we're dealing with problems that are very complex, and there might be a scale mismatch between what the problem is, resources that extension have access to, and the traditional mission of extension, and how does that fit with those larger, more complex problems that we're asking extension to work on. So I think that implies to a lot of things, such as mental health, but also climate change, addressing injustices in the food system. The other thing too that I really want to think about is and talk about it, and we've talked a lot about the US, but I think we've recognized that those are global issues, right? And what can we learn from one another? What can we learn from other systems where things are working, not working so much? And you brought up the La Via Competencia, but also like what are different solutions that are being implemented that are maybe making a difference in important ways, but maybe they're not as traditional as foreign policies. And I do want to point to a study. We haven't talked a whole lot about research and where research has been, but one of the big areas of opportunities that I see for research is how do we document the different ways that systems work in supporting farmers in a lot of different ways. And one study in particular that I keep going back to, and it's a book written in French, but essentially what they did is they wanted to understand what's the impact of ag policies on farmers' well-being and ill-being in agriculture. And that book was really well done, where they looked at the ag policy system, they looked at lots of different systems, and they looked at social policy that was in Canada, France, and Switzerland. And lo and behold, the system that they found was seemingly making the most difference was social policy, and was the idea that if we enable people to meet their basic needs, the blow of the crisis, there's that resilience built in where the blow of the crisis is going to be maybe not as dire as a system like the US, for example, where health insurance is not a given for everyone and it's very expensive. So I'll leave it there.
Well, this just to follow up on what Florence said, agricultural policy is very important, but we also may need to look at more general social policies. For example, if we really want to support small-scale farmers, then perhaps a guaranteed minimum income is the appropriate social or household policy to address, issues that are not just specific to the agricultural sector. So that's, I know answering a question with a question perhaps it's not the best type of answer, but it is something in a sense just for us to consider. We need to be very cognizant of agricultural policy. In today's Raleigh paper, there was a story about how there may be defunding of a program that was created earlier this year to help poultry farmers. So yes, indeed, we need to be very cognizant and aware of what's going on. But we also may need to look at these issues, particularly of household income and resilience, as a more general social policy that may have unique features in agriculture, but also, in a sense, may be an issue for forming alliances to groups outside of the ag sector. Thank you.
I really like actually having more questions because I think it gets to the fact that, you know, what's amazing about a panel like this is a sense that there isn't hubris, but instead a lot of knowledge that still comes with doubt about what we can do and how we can act in a way to build a more sustainable, healthy, and economically viable future, not just for agrarian communities, but globally. So I think it is great to leave with questions. I'd like to thank the panel for this amazing discussion. I'd like to thank Mary for moderating and keeping us all on track and really providing a space for this conversation to flourish. And lastly, I appreciate the audience for joining us today. I'd like to note one more time, this recording will be made available to the public so that y'all can access it. And if you would like to ask a follow-up question, you may email me, and I will be happy to respond or refer you out to someone that actually has the answer you're looking for. So yes, have a wonderful rest of your week, everybody, and we'll close it out there.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks, everyone.